Hello everyone, thank you for watching. I'm Russ LeBlanc, your personal NEC consultant and code expert. In this video, I'm going to be discussing splices for temporary power. And first, we want to take a look at some requirements in Article 590. 590 is the article that covers temporary installations, and that's for electric power or lighting. Temporary power for lighting or power. That's Article 590. I think one of the most important rules in this article is 590.2, and it's a reminder. Except as specifically modified in Article 590, all other requirements for permanent wiring apply to temporary wiring installations. So at just one example, we could give a million examples. Example, generally speaking, Section 300.15 is going to require splices to be installed in boxes or other enclosures, okay? But 590 may modify that requirement, and it does. Let's see how. All right, here's one way, 590.4G, splices, a box, conduit body, or other enclosure with a cover installed shall be required for all splices. That's pretty straightforward, right? And there's no changes proposed for this requirement for 2026, so we don't have to cover it for 2026. No technical changes. There might be some numbering changes. It's probably going to be 590.6 instead of 590.4, but no technical changes. Now let's take a look at exception 1. Now this applies only on construction sites, but it does apply to feeders or branch circuits on construction sites. On construction sites, a box, conduit body, or other enclosure is not required for either of the following conditions. Item 1, the circuit conductors being spliced are all from non-metallic multi-conductor cords or cables, provided we maintain the continuity of the equipment grounding conductor. Okay. Item 2, the circuit conductors being spliced are all from metal sheathed cables, terminated in listed fittings that will mechanically secure the cable sheaths to maintain effective electrical continuity. And again, no technical changes for exception 1 were proposed for 2026. So let's take a look at some graphics to see how it applies. All right, here's an example of some non-metallic flexible cords being spliced for temporary power, no box needed. All right, and again, we could do the same for a feeder as well. This happens to be a branch circuit, but you see the splices there where the black tape is next to the green, where is it? Green thumb. Give that the thumbs up. Don't need a box on construction sites there. Now let's take a look at another one. This is some NM cables being spliced. Very common to use NM cables for temporary power because it's relatively inexpensive, and you can use a lot of it, and it's easy to install, right? So we see the 2 NM cables being spliced there. No box needed, not required. Now we could do the same thing with SER cables or SE cables. These are also non-metallic cables. So if you wanted to splice feeders, you could do that without a box, as long as you maintain continuity of the equipment grounding conductor. Okay, so it doesn't matter if it's a branch circuit or a feeder. So it would apply to cables like NM cable, SE cable, SER cable, UF cables. These are all non-metallic cables. Now for metal cables, we have exception 1, item 2. Box is not required when circuit conductors being spliced, and again, this is for branch circuits and feeders as well. When the conductors being spliced are from all metal sheath cables, terminated in listed fittings, and the fitting will secure the cables to the fitting and bond the cables together to maintain that effective electrical continuity. So again, we got the thumbs up for this. No box needed. Doesn't matter if that's a feeder or a branch circuit. You can splice just like that on a construction site with no box. Here we got a problem. There's no fitting there. There's no way to maintain continuity between those metal cable sheaths. That is a thumbs down. That is not code compliant right there. So we can't do that on a construction site. Can't do it anywhere, really. Not for temporary power, certainly not for permanent installations. Now let's take a look at exception 2. Now there were some revisions proposed for exception 2, so let's see what 2023 says, and then we'll see what's proposed for 2026. On construction sites, when branch circuits, so this rule only applies to branch circuits, when branch circuits permanently installed in framed-in walls and ceilings are used to supply temporary power or temporary lighting and are GFCI protected, not SPGFCI protected, but GFCI protected, the following is permitted. Whoopsie. Number 1, a box cover is not required for splices installed completely inside of, it says, junction boxes with plasterings, right? So it has to have a plastering, it has to be a junction box. That's what it says, right? But we want to pay attention to the specifics there and the nuances. Junction boxes with plasterings. No cover needed if the splices are inside a junction box with plastering, and you can energize that wiring for temporary purposes. And if you want to install some temporary lighting, item 2 says listed pigtail lamp holders are permitted to be installed in ceiling mounted. Again, junction boxes with plasterings is the wording. So there has to be a plastering in order for you to energize it for temporary lighting purposes. And then finger safe devices are also permitted for supplying and connection of devices. And I will show you some finger safe devices. So now at the top, my wording says exception 2 may permit these permanent wires to be energized for temporary power. I'm pretty sure the intent of exception 2 is to apply to a box just like this on a construction site where you have the branch circuit wires completely inside the box and there is a plastering, and you might want to energize this permanent wiring for temporary power or temporary lighting, and you can do that if it's GFCI protected. But I have a couple questions. One of them is, does exception 2 even apply to this type of box? Now, I don't know about you, but I would not call that a junction box. I would call that an outlet box. Now, exception 2 does say junction box. It doesn't say outlet box. So we could debate that, right? Is this a junction box or is it an outlet box? Some people might say it's a junction box. Some people might say it's an outlet box. I'm going to say it's an outlet box. But I still think exception 2, the intent is to apply to even this type of box, even though it says junction box versus outlet box. Now, there are different types of standards. There are several different standards to cover the different types of boxes, if you will. So one of them is UL 50. UL 50 covers pull and junction boxes. Okay? And then for outlet boxes, it's UL 514. Right? And these UL 514 applies to boxes having a volume of no more than 100 cubic inches. All right, so those are the limits there. And then there's some subcategories of UL 514. 514A applies to metal outlet boxes. And then 514C applies to non-metallic outlet boxes. All right, here's an example of a pull or a junction box covered by UL 50. I don't know anybody that calls that an outlet box. That is a junction box. And here's a metal outlet box covered by UL 514A. I don't think I would call that a junction box. Most people are going to call that an outlet box. Here's a non-metallic outlet box. And this is, again, covered by UL 514C. So we could debate, what's a junction box, what's an outlet box, because there are different product standards. But I think the intent is to include outlet boxes, even though it says junction boxes. So, splitting hairs, I guess. But in any case, the box you see in the graphic here, you cannot energize these wires. There is no plastering, first of all, right? So in order to energize those wires for temporary power, if we don't want to put cover on there, there has to be a plastering. Now, when I read the substantiation for this change, there wasn't a whole lot of substantiation about the plastering. Why does it have to have a plastering? Why can't we energize the wires in that box right there for temporary purposes and not put a cover on? There was no substantiation saying this is why the plastering has to be on. Nothing. So that might change for 2026. But right now, you could not energize those wires for temporary power, even if it's GFCI protected. Now, if you put a cover on, you could energize it, right? But if you don't want to put a cover on, they haven't painted yet, so you probably don't want the cover on, right? The covers would have to go on and off, on and off, on and off. You'd have to energize, de-energize, energize, de-energize when they're, painting, for example. Here's another box, and there's no plastering on this one. So if you want to energize the wires in this box for temporary purposes, you would have to put a cover on there. And again, that's because there's no plastering. And when it comes to temporary lighting in the ceiling, that outlet box, if you want to energize the permanent wiring in that outlet box, well, you can't unless there's a cover because there's no plastering. A little quirky, but that's the requirement. So there has to be a plastering. Then you can energize the wires for temporary lighting. Even though it's permanent wiring, you want to energize it for temporary lighting purposes and not put a cover on. Well, you can't do that with this type of box. You'd have to put a cover on because there's no plastering. Now, exception 2, there are some proposals, public input, if you will, public comments to revise the requirements for exception 2. So let's see what's proposed for 2026. First thing is a number change. So 590.4 becomes 590.6. And 590.4G becomes 590.6F. Okay, and then exception 2. Let's take a look at the wording proposed for 2026. On construction sites, so no change there. Where branch circuits, still only for branch circuits. On construction sites, when branch circuits permanently installed and framed in walls and ceilings and are used to supply temporary power lighting and are GFCI protected, not SPGFCI protected, the following is permitted. And there's 3 things we want to look at. Item 1, a box cover is not required for splices installed completely inside of junction boxes, with or without plasterings. Nice. And outlet boxes or device boxes. So the plasterings are irrelevant now, and it's pretty much any type of box. And for the temporary lighting pigtails, you can energize the permanent wiring. If it's GFCI protected, you can energize the permanent wiring in ceiling mounted box. Whether there's a plastering or not is irrelevant. And it doesn't matter what we call that box. It doesn't matter if it's a junction box, an outlet box, or a device box. We don't have to put a cover on it. We can energize it without a cover as long as it's GFCI protected and get some temporary lighting. And this is very common on construction sites because, at this point, it might be, they're getting ready to paint. And it might be, temporary cables run through walls that got put up, right? And so you can just go in there and kill the temporary cables, cut them out. They can patch the holes and stop painting. But now you have no light, so you could use the permanent wiring and install a pigtail lamp holder and get some temporary lights up. Very common. And the third item is finger-safe devices are still permitted for supplying and connection of devices. And I'll show you a finger-safe device in a minute. Okay, so for 2026, exception 2 will still permit permanent wires installed in boxes with plasterings to be energized for temporary power purposes. And in 2026, exception 2 will permit wires installed in boxes without plasterings and without covers to be energized for temporary power purposes. Again, it has to be GFCI protected. And exception 2 for 2026 will allow you to energize the wires in that ceiling box right there, permanent wires installed in that ceiling box. You can energize that temporary light socket. It would need GFCI protection, but you do not have to put a cover on the box. That's pretty cool. Now let's talk about energizing devices, like receptacles, for example, with no cover. Can we energize this receptacle for temporary power? No, you cannot. There has to be a cover on that plate. There has to be a cover on that box, excuse me. Cover plate, cover, whatever you want to call it. You cannot energize that receptacle the way that sits in the wall right now. You can see the terminals there. you could easily make contact with those terminals and get a shock. All right, now let's take a look at a finger-safe device. Receptacles like this and other types of finger-safe devices, there's different types. This is just one example. There's no exposed terminals, so you can't really get a shock. Right? You're not going to accidentally touch any exposed live terminals because there aren't any. So you can install receptacles like this in the wall, in the box, right? Energize these. You don't have to put the cover plate on because you can't really get a shock. There's the back of that receptacle. And again, so a device like this, whether it's a receptacle or even a switch like this, you can energize the wires. You don't have to put the cover plates on, right? Putting the cover plates on is kind of a pain in the butt because things have to be painted and they don't want marks where the covers are. So you don't want the covers on when you're painting, really. But it's a shock hazard if there's exposed energized terminals. So these are the types of the devices that you'd want to install. And then you don't have to worry about putting cover plates on to energize the wires. Hopefully these changes go through. I think it'll make it a little easier for installers for temporary wiring and using the permanent wires for temporary power in 2026 and future. If you like this video, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up. And as always, if you want more information, if you want to check out some other videos and podcasts and pictures and all other kinds of cool stuff I have, check out my website, russellblank.net. I will see you in the next video.